Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hi, everyone. Stephen Vantassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife, which we deal with vertebrate pest control from a research-based perspective. So if you have issues with wildlife control, animals with a spine, you've come to the right place because we get into some very technical information about all things related to wildlife damage management. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. You could reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Yes, comments, thoughts, suggestions for new shows, and yes, even criticisms. You can reach me there. If you're new to the show, we'd love to have you subscribe to the channel, and also ring the bell so you can be made aware of new podcasts that come out. Typically, they come out once a week, and we're on YouTube and Rumble. So as you can tell, we have a guest today. His name is Dave Hastings. He is the author of Badger Trapping, a book that was published in 2024. So it's new. Badger trapping is kind of a mysterious little world because there's not a lot of literature on badger trapping. And so he has moved into this foray. So I was interested because we have badgers, of course, in Montana. And a lot of producers, of course, hate badgers with an absolute passion. I have a soft spot for badgers, but as any animal that digs, I have a soft spot for. So he's going to talk about trapping badgers, and of course, he hails from Nebraska. If you're wondering, Dave Hastings, that sounds familiar. He used to be the editor for the Fur Takers of America magazine. So he was the editor for that for how many years, Dave?
20,
20?
25.
Yeah. So it was a
I'd have to
long
do some research.
It was a long time, all right? So so he retired from that several years ago. Dave, we're really glad to have you on board here. Tell us a little about yourself and what got you into trapping.
Well, I don't know exactly. A person follows whatever attraction hits you when you're 10 years old.
Uh-huh.
My father was a hunter and a fisherman, but by the time I was in my point in my life, he wasn't very engaged anymore. So everything I did in that regard, I sort of stumbled into as a young child would do, and found that I think being in the out of doors was a good therapy for me. I found the fourth grade and the fifth grade to be a little bit like some kind of a sentence where I was watching the second hand push toward the clock. And it didn't take long for me to get out of those school clothes and into the weeds. And that's basically what it's been. And it still continues. Now I'm over 70 and nothing enhances my day more than an hour walking the dog on the beach. It's just,
Okay.
yeah, get it out. So,
Look at that. So you've been involved in the trapping industry for a really long time. You're uh one of the godfathers of the area, to be sure. So what got you interested in writing a book on badger trapping? So your experience with school kind of throws me a little bit because my understanding is you became an English teacher.
well, right.
Yeah.
Which is typical for what might be considered multi-personality,
Yeah.
lack of focus. But uh, I did. What got me started with trapping and outside was that it was alone and away from everything. And by the time I got around toward the end of my high school career, I people look at you and say, "What will you be when you grow up?" So to
Right,
speak.
right.
I was a little blind on that, but I found that I could read and write pretty well. I don't mean penmanship, but I mean compose.
Right, right.
And someone my senior year said, "Well, you ought to look at education." And I was a little bit put off because I wanted away from education pretty badly at that point. But
Hmm.
anyway, long story short, I have my professional career, which was with words and sharing and teaching with people. Teaching of writing was wonderful for me. Teaching of debate, uh, to me, was the most valuable uh, thing I've ever offered to another human being. I'd have kids show up to learn to debate and want to be a debate class, and I would begin to tell them about what an argument looks like and a logical process looks like, And as all students are, we doubt the teacher knows anything about what he's talking about. But when I would take them to a tournament and they would get their plow cleaned, they would come back and say, "Now, what was that part about the three-stage rebuttal process?" All of
Yeah.
a sudden there was a clarity to the mission, and it was a wonderful experience. I had
Yeah.
students go on to be several in law school. One was a legal representative in The Hague, and
Oh,
several
wow.
lawyers
Okay.
today. Fun stuff. And it wasn't all because of that. I'm not trying to claim that. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that few things in life reward you better than to share something with someone who puts value in what they got.
Right.
And
Right.
and I don't know how to express that anymore. Uh, I did take advantage of my outside time. I did a lot of coaching in high school, a lot of teaching. So when I was young and single and trapping, I would be whatever minute I could get into the waders and go get wet or get out in the dark, I did. But as I got older, we had the family, things got more and more complicated, and
Mhm.
time was challenging and paying bills and getting things
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know. Like all schizophrenics, the parts that fit together for me are not normally measurable. They just fell there and I grabbed them and I'm still hanging on to the ride. So as far as what got me to talk about badgers is that I've trapped badgers for decades and decades. I mean, not prolifically, but significantly, and I've always admired them. I find them fascinating, and I honestly I was looking through a couple of the catalogs on fur harvest related books, and I
Mhm.
just noticed there were no books on badgers, and
No,
so.
it
Uh,
is empty. Hold your book up there for the audience.
Oh,
So
okay.
this is what
It's
makes
it's
your,
it's a
yeah.
real
So
clever title
badger
called
trapping.
Badger
So
Trapping. Yeah,
it
it's one of
is what
those
it is.
board games. Yeah.
Now, yeah. So his English writing does come through in this book, folks. So you will get some quotes from Thoreau, of all people,
Okay.
someone from the big state of Massachusetts with Walden Pond. So he has some thoughts on the wandering in the woods from Thoreau. So
Yeah.
that was rather interesting. So this is going to be a not only an informative piece, but a literary piece as well. So you're getting both worlds. And yeah, the information on badgers is so slim. And so why do you think that is? Because people do like the fur. I mean, I don't think there's a huge market for the badger fur, but it certainly is a boutique market, I guess, for badger skin.
Absolutely. And no question,
Oh, it's
it's a
gorgeous.
beautiful, gorgeous product. Uh, Most of the research that we have, or a good part of the research that we have on wildlife is at least partially spawned by the necessity of successful management. And so the more expensive the damage caused by the animal, the more likely you're going to get funded for a project or
That
research.
that's certainly
So,
true. Yeah, that makes
so for
sense.
example, animals like coyotes traditionally were a huge impact on both the sheep and cattle and lots of other industries. And so
Yeah.
there's a voluminous
Oh my
article.
gosh, it's
A few
staggering.
people like Dr. Kim and a few others just have spent their life working there, and it's all fascinating. There's some on mountain lion because of the depredation
Mhm.
situation. There's certainly interesting things like skunk, where uh, as an urban removal issue, people are alarmed by them, worried by them, probably enhanced or triggered by the fact that they have a tendency to be a vector for rabies and some other definitive diseases. And so I suspect that helped in college graduate students' funding and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So Badger is an outlier in most of what we would call the sexy things for wildlife
Yeah.
research.
Yeah. And
Uh,
its range is a little bit smaller too, so that hasn't helped in terms of being
right,
A Great Plains beast primarily.
pretty much
Yeah.
from the mountainous west to, I mean, we took badgers almost every year in our trappers college in Indiana.
Hmm.
There are a few there. They're sort of like residents that everybody knows
Yeah.
about. Wisconsin, contrary to what you would think about the badger state,
Yeah.
has a few badgers, but doesn't have an open season to my knowledge. I think the reason they chose badgers in reference to the hard ground miners who were common in the beginnings of the state of
Oh,
Wisconsin. So
okay.
it
Interesting.
wasn't so much on our mammal as it was on some
Oh,
sort of
okay.
metaphor for people who were hardworking earthy
Right,
people.
right.
So,
Okay. Because that, yeah, I thought that was just that the species was primarily extirpated from the state, but you're
well,
thinking it might have been just a reference to another behavior, like
well,
mining or
and
something.
like all good mascots, nonsense probably played a good part in it too. But there is a ferocity and a
Yeah,
intimidation and
yeah,
tenacity and all the
right.
good things about Badgers that people would like to instill in whatever their volleyball team or whatever it is they're touting, you know. But other than that, in terms of the general research, their wildlife damage has not been financially significant. I think one of the studies that I got into indicated that badger depredation in 4 or 5 different Western states accounted for like 2% or 3% of all wildlife damage, which
Yeah,
uh, that matters.
it
But
does.
it doesn't matter in terms of the big dollar university research
That's
funded
right.
programs and things like that. So uh, the second reason is because the darn things, they're periods of torpor where they go into a hibernation, not real hibernation, but a hibernation-like
Yeah.
state for quite some time, make them very difficult. I mean, you'd be waiting a long time for a badger to come up out of the ground if he's
Mm,
into one of his whatever 40, 60 hour periods of torpor with no data. And so subterraneous activities, uh, they're a different critter in winter than they are in summer. They're a different critter in northern Montana than they are in Texas as well, because the climate requires animals in Montana and North Dakota to find a way to survive those super
mm,
cold weather. So
yeah,
they do a lot of subterraneous living and near hibernation. So it's tough to track them. So that yeah, I guess that's generally it. And you know, I don't know. I've just always been fascinated by them, and I find them remarkably beautiful and interesting. And I said, well, why not? You know, I think there is a residual activity of spending your working life writing, composing, analyzing, and then you're no longer working, and it's like I don't know how to stop writing. So
right.
I
Well, it's therapeutic, right? It's so I have
well,
to,
therapeutic
it
and
is.
it's almost like it's like a OCD activity that I
Hmm.
don't know how to
Yeah.
quit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there we go. But
So for
uh,
someone who has, looking, they may have some clients. Again, everyone, badgers are never going to be a major part of your business. That's just, there are not that many of them to make it. It's not like squirrels or, moles, depending what part of the country you're in, maybe even pocket gophers. But badgers are going to be, but they can be one of those niche animals that you may encounter typically in areas where you're going to have a lot more open space, open grasslands because they're. So, what are some of the tools? What would be some initial advice you'd have for someone? They're like, I have a client with badgers. They've called me up and they want me to come and remove the badger. I've never dealt with badgers before. What would be the initial advice? Don't take the job. What or what would be your caveats that you'd give them? Because you had several caveats in your book about the difficulty in trapping badgers.
right,
Yeah,
right. I think the first thing, and I'm sure this is true, I'm not, I am not a professional wildlife damage control person. So
right.
part of my amateur work is maybe appropriate, maybe not. But to me, that initial conversation is so valuable. I had a lady call me and say, I have a badger. I need you over here right away. And I said, okay, can you tell me a little bit about what's going on? She said, well, he keeps coming and eating my tomatoes. And it was like, uh, I don't think you have
It's
a
not
badger. No, she
that's
had a
not a
groundhog
badger.
and didn't know the difference, you know. So that first initial conversation, other big things that make them challenging, unlike, for example, coyotes,
Yeah.
that can be a urban or rural problem. Uh, seasonality is so unusual for them. One of the big differences has to do with the fact that the badgers, being part of that mustelid family, tend to do their breeding in August as
Yeah.
opposed to November, as a lot of our fur bearers would do. And so when I do get complaints, many times they are middle of August. And that becomes a real challenge because if you're after a male badger who is looking for a prom date, let's say,
Hmm.
and he's on the prowl, he may dig a hole in somebody's yard and then in the morning not find any females available and move on. And so you're going to have a hard time convincing the client that your services were worth the trouble because you didn't catch a badger. He may no longer be there to catch. Uh, July is the worst time, or August, even early September is very difficult because badgers are so focused on that breeding that they're difficult to trap and they're rarely coming back. Now, there are some exceptions to that. For example, people who have, let's say, they have a backyard chicken coop. When a badger focuses on a backyard chicken coop, whenever it occurs,
Mm.
he becomes fairly easy to trap because he's coming back. He's coming back until the chickens are gone.
Yeah.
And because he has shown a willingness to climb through a woven wire fence or whatever it took to get there, he's probably not going to be averse to a good cage trap in the right location. And you also know that you know where he wants to go. And having that piece of information is probably critical to any kind of damage work. Where does he want to be? And how do I get there ahead of him and prepare so that I'm ready when he gets there? Um, uh,
Would you think that the chicken coop was one example. Are there any other examples that said, do they eat dog food? Do they eat cat food that you're aware of in your
they're a
experience?
generalist. They're a
Okay.
generalist,
Yeah.
but like all wildlife, they tend to be seasonally triggered by things. Uh, um, in this part of the world, for example, the raccoon population is all most of it. We have lots of irrigation ditches in Nebraska where we're irrigating fields, and about this time of year, the crops are done. They shut off the water. The water recedes. A summer's worth of tadpoles and minnows and fish and frogs are all in a tiny puddle in a little place. And raccoons become so aware of that they'll avoid all other. They won't eat chickens. They won't eat corn in the garden. They'll be there on that pond
Right.
until the water dries up, and then
Mm.
they're off to something else. And badger are a little bit like that. In that August and September time, they're so hard to get ready to get after. And the other thing is many animals, especially the males, tend to have a home range and a home territory, but badgers are so unpredictable with that. And that was one of my big disappointments in that very little work that I could find defined too much valuable data on what their home range and home
Yeah.
territory is. So, frankly speaking, I get a lot of calls in the summer where a guy has an alfalfa field and he's getting ready to mow and he's bouncing over all these holes. And he thinks he has a lot of badgers when he really doesn't. A badger will get after a ground squirrel or a pocket gopher, dig a hole. If it fails, he'll dig another hole. If it fails, you might have 7 holes.
Mm.
He eventually gets into a nest and eats his fill and goes on about his way. So the client uh, thinks he has 7 badgers in his hayfield and wants them all killed right now. So
Yeah.
uh, there's an education component that I'm sure is true in any kind, whether it's spat work or coon work or any kind of wildlife thing, that there aren't 7 badgers there. As a matter of fact, you never have 7 badgers in one place.
Right.
They tend to be allopatric in their behaviors in that they don't like to overlap much. And about the only time they do is during that breeding season when the males are looking for females. And in some circumstances, in my experience, if he does locate with the female and mate, they're together for a few days, and then that's the end of
Yeah.
it.
Yep.
They're gone. And so if that was what brought them to the damaged location, you're going to have a long, sorry, non-productive wait for him to
Yeah.
come back,
Yeah,
so.
my reading had a few things when I was doing some reading about it. It said when Badgers basically reduce the food source in an area down to 20% of the original number. They typically move on.
Mhm.
I think another publication was talking about how the home ranges varied basically on food supply. So the higher
Sure.
concentration of food supply, the smaller the home range, and then of course it would expand if it was thinner. And then you have the only animal that really stays in the same den for any extended period of time is primarily the female with young, and even then that may only be for a couple of weeks, and she may move them along somewhere else if my memory is serving. So there's such a transient nature. And the only clue, and this is something that you came up with in your book, which I'm always fascinated by what I call naturalists, people that are in the field like yourself and just observing how your information often dovetails with, the professional researchers, right? And so they were saying, how do you know there's a badger in the den? And typically they'll partially fill the hole. And that was the sign that you mentioned. It's like, if it looks bare all the way in, he's probably not there. It's the ones that have a little bit of debris, and if it's colder, they'll often kind of even backfill it even more. And that's the clue to tell you that something's there, because that was your experience.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It is accurate and valuable about I don't know, I'm gonna pick a
Yeah, it may not be
20% of the
perfect.
time.
Yeah,
You know,
but it's more your odds are better with that
exactly.
than than the other, right? So
That's right.
that's the thing. So it was just fascinating. So I just wonder how it's so you have what is some of the equipment? So let's say so first of all, if someone just has a small residential lawn, chances unless they have a chicken coop back there that's going to be that magnet, I guess that food magnet, chances are it's not even worth their while to take the job. They're just going to make an angry client most likely.
Or an
Um,
angry neighbor.
or an
Yes.
angry neighbor. Yeah. So otherwise, so that's the first step to learn. That could be very valuable. You got to know when not to take a job, or if your client has to be completely understanding that you could have a trap there, do everything right, and there's nothing there to catch. So make sure your client's informed. But what are some of the equipment that you use? Or that you recommend in terms of for trapping badgers? What do you like to use?
Uh, well, generally speaking, there's nothing that I would call badger specific. Anybody who works with trapping mammals uh, probably is pretty well versed with most of the tools, primarily the cage trap or foot trap or body gripping traps, snares,
Yep.
and all of those things are functional. Uh, but depending upon your circumstances, a fairly busy urban area where maybe you have free roaming pet cats and things like that, that takes a lot of those
Right.
off the agenda. So you're almost down to a cage trap. I think the one exception, and you mentioned this, is if you do have a badger hole that's mostly or completely backfilled and you suspect that he's still in there. Uh, I find that a lethal body gripping trap is very effective in that. Uh,
Any
but you have to
particular
make sure
size?
that, pardon me,
Any particular size?
I this the 280 to me, the 8 inch, the 220 is also effective. Badgers are tough, and I don't know if this is appropriate. I don't want to make a product endorsement, but I
Yep.
find that the body gripping traps that have the Canadian bend on them,
Mhm.
which require a very tight closing trap and increase lethality, are recommended here. The
Okay.
Belial, for example, is
Belial.
the one that I'm most familiar with.
Yep.
Uh, they're very strong and they're also very tight in closure. Most of the American-made body gripping traps have that concern over user liability. What if we
Yeah.
injure someone?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so both the Carnivore and some of those other brands tend to have a little bit of a space
Yeah.
whereas the Canadian bend has a tight closure.
Tight
But
closure.
it's almost immediate to follow then that live trap in the hole must be protected from uh, non-target animals from wandering in from the outside.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it must be covered, whatever device that would cover it will work for you. I'm a collector of odd, eclectic things, but I happen to have an old grocery cart with the wheels off of it. And I turned the old grocery cart upside down over the hole with the trap in it. So
Okay.
it's an occlusive device that prevents anybody from entering. The same thing could be done with several different types of wire baskets and other things, but it's important that,
That's for the conibear.
correct. That's
For the
for the
conibear,
body
yeah.
gripping trap.
So
Yeah,
you're screening it off so that an outside animal isn't going to get into it. And that's
right.
a now understand, just take a little pause here. Just for those of you in states where conibears on land aren't legal, then this obviously is a technique you shouldn't use. Even if it is legal in your state, buyer, user beware, because there's no second chances with the conibear. Even if the animal's still alive when you get there, it's not going to be in good enough condition to salvage. So make sure you keep your wits about you. And I would certainly encourage you, if you're using a conibear trap, to do as Dave suggests here, and that is to screen that off with hardware cloth or some sort of a cage type device so that you're only catching what comes out of that hole, which you anticipate to be the badger. Otherwise, things could go very wrong for
Well,
you.
certainly, and you know far better than I, but there are also just a huge array of different regulations in different states, and that
Absolutely.
first
Yeah.
thing is comply with those.
Comply with those without a doubt. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. But I
similar
like to
kind.
remind people that just because it's legal doesn't always make it
Exactly.
wise.
Oh, absolutely,
So
absolutely.
we
Yeah,
have enough bad news in our industry without feeding the fire, as folks.
yeah.
So I just
I,
want to
I
make sure
have.
that's clear.
It might be helpful to add what I have tried that I don't recommend. For
Yeah,
example,
absolutely.
I did try using a snare over
Hmm.
that hole.
Okay.
Uh, the first problem, it has to be rigidly held in place
Mm.
because the badger's coming out pushing dirt. And so
Oh, okay.
whatever's
All
in
right.
the way is kind of destroyed. So
Yeah.
that's another tip with putting either a snare or a body grip in the hole is you kind of
Yeah.
want to clean the majority of the occlusion so that there's not landfill coming out by the bushel, whatever device you use. A foot trap would work too, but again, that's a I'm in a rural area and I can comfortably use
Hmm.
a foot trap. I rarely, honestly, frankly, I rarely try to catch at the hole. There are
Okay.
just so many ways that that can go awry. And it's probably not necessary. If I'm in a circumstance where a foot trap is usable and it's not going to get me into non-target trouble or whatever the circumstances would be, I find that badger are pretty interested in most any typical mammal attraction. Uh, uh, as lure or bait goes, there are a lot of choices, and most of them will work, particularly if you're within 6 feet of the hole when his head pokes out. You have an attentive client by design that would be interested in a probably anything, fruit bait, nut bait,
Mm.
stinky bait, meat bait. They are carnivorous, and so I tend to lean toward those attractions that would be appropriate for carnivores.
Right.
And but they're omnivorous too. They eat insects and they eat grains. And but I think if you're going to attract one, my what would be typical for a coyote attraction or a fox attraction would be what I would go to if you're not where non-targets are around.
Size of trap, size of foothold.
They're a very strong animal, but so technically speaking, a number one long spring would hold a badger. The problem is that the badger's front foot, because of those claw configurations, quite large.
Yeah.
And so I tend to lean toward probably 5-inch jaw spread, maybe a little bigger if I have it. Not because the animal's foot is that, or not that the animal's that big, but his foot is that big, and
Yeah.
particularly his front foot, which is usually my target when I'm
Target for
trying to
capture.
capture him.
Yeah.
So the number three coil or long spring, number two coil or long spring, those are both appropriate. I mentioned in the book that my favorite by far is the Sterling 600. It has a 6-inch jaw spread, and we could do a podcast on my feelings about the physics of a Sterling trap. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
those would be the traps. Um, Good strong chain, good strong stakes. Um, One caveat that's extremely important with trapping badger is that a short chain is bad news because when a badger's in a trap, he digs. And if you have him on a 6-inch chain, he is going to excavate a hole the size of a pickup box, and that will probably dislodge an earth anchor
Yeah.
or a trap anchor or a stake. And interestingly enough, if you have a 30-inch chain, he just digs in a circle forever. No problem at all. He's not clever enough to recognize the physics of his dilemma.
Right.
He
Right.
just knows that when you get in bad trouble, you dig.
And you
And
want
so,
multiple swivels on that chain? You have
absolutely.
two, three swivels is
I
probably
would say
enough.
absolute minimum of three, one at the trap,
Minimum of
one
three.
at the stake, and one in the center. Uh, if the whole chain was out of swivels, it wouldn't hurt a darn thing, but it would be
Right.
redundant. But
Yeah. A
yeah,
little redundant.
but, uh,
Yeah.
but swivels are very important. But again, in terms of trap injury, um, certain animals, felines, particular, fox, and coyotes, they're so averse to being captured that their behavior is extremely erratic,
Yeah.
and they tend to do things that lead toward injury. Badger, on the other hand, just digs.
Right.
I don't think he pulls much. I don't think he stresses. He doesn't chew on his foot. He just digs.
Just
And
digs.
that preoccupation is a good thing in
Yeah.
that he's not mentioning that. It's a bad thing if you're on somebody's lawn because you're going to excavate a gravesite
Right.
in somebody's front lawn. And the owner, your client is now going to assume that it would be much better to have the badger there than you as the trap, so.
Right. So prepare your client if you catch one, right? I guess that would be one advantage of a cage trap, right? So you
Or
would have
yes,
some, he'd probably excavate the soil in through the cage floor, but that would be about the extent of it.
same
So
thing with
that
with the lethal body grip. There's
right
very little
with the
digging
body
going
grab.
on, and it
Yeah.
causes less destruction. But yeah,
Okay.
that's pluses and minuses. So
Uh,
I
are you
mentioned in the
baiting?
book I was carry
Yeah.
a
Are you
scoring
baiting
ring.
your cage? Are you baiting your cage traps, or you put them in a blind set over the hole?
If you have a specific, I mean, sometimes you can tell where the hole in the woven wire fence is into the chicken coop, and so the I
Oh,
wouldn't
okay.
I wouldn't bait it. I wouldn't distract it because you want him to go where he wants to go. A double
Right.
door trap over
Okay.
that hole would be
Yeah.
the ideal. Uh, they will respond to bait, but like many animals, and this is a little bit of a unresearched, but something I adhere to pretty definitively. If an animal is on his way to a preconditioned decision, he's pretty hard to get his attention.
Mm,
You're probably going to catch him leaving more than you will by entering.
by
If he's
entering.
there to get in the chicken coop, no amount of beef or meat or tallow or fish is going to get his attention. He might on the way out. And that's why using that double door cage trap, where you're just going to take advantage of what he's already decided to do, rather than try to get him to alter his plans to accommodate you. But they're not extremely trap shy. They're not, I would say, in terms of predator averse for awareness. Coyotes can demonstrate quite a bit of canny avoidance.
Mm,
Badgers, not so much. He
yeah.
he's on a mission. He's pretty tough. He's not too shy. Uh, make it attractive, and you'll have him. So.
The Do you think that there's any can we go, let's go over some safety issues with badgers. What should someone be considering? And let's say they're not using a cage trap, they're using a foothold, they have their 30-inch chain, they have it anchored deeply enough to be sure it's not going to get pulled out or more excavated, and that what should they be worried about as they approach? Is there a lunging issue with the animal? Is there?
Typically not. They're not. Felines, for example, can be so erratic. I've had bobcats just hide from me, and I've had other bobcats act like they're going to come climb in the pickup and kill me if they get a chance.
Hmm.
Badger's going to be typically in the hole, and sometimes so far in the hole that you can't tell there's a hole there. You
Oh,
come back and you find it looks like somebody's run a rototiller around and you can't see anything. Well, somewhere in there is a badger that's buried himself, and all kinds of sensible caution are in order because badger are ferocious and they're mean. I mean, they're not. I mean, it's not a Kilimanjaro lion by any means, but if you put your hand in front of his face, you're going to lose a digit,
mm,
and that would common sense would require that you avoid that at all costs. But the thing about it is when he's in the hole, and I think I mentioned this in the book and I can't remember, but when I was a kid, I used to think if I just grab a hold of what chain I could find, I could drag him backward out of the hole. I did that one time, pull the trap off his foot, and that was very discouraging because
mm,
now I'd released the badger. He was buried in the ground, and I was plumb out of luck. And
okay.
so certain amount of excavation is required to expose them sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're back down in the hole, and you look in there and you see that badged face, that you
Yeah.
see the face. And it depending upon your circumstances and your legalities, I find that I like a low caliber, quiet 22 round. I'm it may sound contradictive or hypocritical, but I don't like things to die poorly. I
Right.
want his death to be as efficient and as quick and as humane as I can make it. And
Yeah.
typically, when the badger is back down a hole, he presents a very good target area right above the brow line.
Hmm.
I've seen for a raccoon, I've seen diagrams where if you're going to use a bullet to dispatch, you draw an X between the ears and the eyes
Hmm.
and the center of the axis. Uh, you don't get that kind of presentation with a badger. You
Right.
just want to hold in that area. And I find that they're not that difficult to dispatch, and I don't have a problem. But I do want to make sure that's quick and efficient over. And I like the quiet. They don't make a lot of noise. I'm not disturbing neighbors. I'm not. It's not quite as violent for the animal, but
Yeah. Like a 22 short out of a handgun, perhaps.
yes, both the short and the quiet are effective.
Subsonic.
Yes, they
Yeah.
are. The one caveat is that they're both a little bit less impactful,
Yeah.
and so shot placement is a little bit more important.
Yeah. Any problems with ricochet off the skull?
Almost never for
Okay.
me.
Okay.
And there's something about that flat area. If you're, this sounds a little bit, if the bullet is going to enter at a 90-degree angle to the skull,
Hmm.
it's way less likely to ricochet.
Yeah.
If you're
Yeah.
shooting at the side of his head or under, and again, I just don't take the shot if that's the case.
Yeah.
If I'm going to pull the trigger, I want it to be quick and efficient. I want him
Right.
dead quickly. And
Any risk of him if you're getting that, if you're seeing him, because you have that 30-inch chain, so you have to make sure that you're far enough away from the anchor, that 30 inches while still shooting. That could be hard to do maybe with a handgun. Maybe you're looking using a rifle to
could
be
be,
sure if you're
yeah,
shooting down into that
yeah.
burrow.
It has that potential, of course, and everybody needs to
Yeah.
be conscious of that and aware of that. But in uh, 50 years of this, I've never had one come out of the hole and come at me.
Okay. All right.
His refuge is buried in the dirt,
Yeah.
even if his face is showing. And so it really isn't, it's never been an issue for me to have one. Now, if he's outside the hole and spinning around in a circle, good caution is required. And you
Yeah.
also want to make sure that you have a background that's safe and all the other
Yeah.
considerations
Yeah.
with
You're
any
right.
gun.
Follow
But
gun safety rules and laws, folks.
I've never, as a matter of fact, I've turned badger loose several times if I was fur trapping and it was
Mhm.
early and they weren't yet prime. And for all their reputation, they're not as ferocious to handle as you might imagine. A catch pole real
Gotcha.
simple, get it on him. The only thing that's hard is the physics of his head. They're kind of narrow on the
Yeah,
nose.
yeah.
And so
Doesn't
you
have
got to
a
make
good
sure
neck, right? He's
you
got
have
to
to get behind the ears or you're
behind
not
the
going to
ear.
hold it.
Yeah.
But once you do, they're pretty docile and you can take the trap off and then
Okay.
everything. They're much easier to handle than say a coyote or uh, other animals. Cats can be uh, cats are less predictable than a
Right.
badger.
Okay.
But I've never had a I've never been bitten by a badger, and but it's important that you say that's because I observe everything I can think of to be cautious and
Yeah.
safe in
Yeah.
approach. So
Now, do you use a sheet of plywood with a hole cut through it so that you could then, if you were trying to release the badger footwise and just use it as a barrier and then release the foot so he's on the other side of the plywood, or you
yeah,
just use a snare pole and kind of stretch him out a little bit and then release him? Or either way, do you have a preference?
the plywood would work, except often he's partially and sometimes completely buried, and
Oh,
so
okay.
you
All
have
right.
to, it's handy to have I have an old hoe handle with the hoe off. And so it has the hook that used to hold the hoe blade. It's not, so anyway, I have a stick that's 5 foot long with a hook on the end. And sometimes what I need to do is pull the badger out and expose him with that while I'm staying outside of that catch circle.
Gotcha.
Then I
Okay.
can get that head the noose on him to release him. And I know trappers honestly who are, and they don't recommend this because it sounds dangerous and it probably is, but they say that once you get that badger out of the hole, you just get behind him, grab him behind the ears, and take the trap off and let him go. And that's on the crazy side of
Yeah, there are some.
asinine behavior. But
I,
and the reason I point it out is that of all the animals that I have that I occasionally release for whatever reason, the badger has been the least likely to harm me.
mm,
And you, given their ferocity and their reputation,
amazing.
they'd be the
Yeah.
most likely to harm you. But it's
Yeah.
just the case. They're first of all, they're not as agile. They're more agile than you think, but
Right.
they're not as agile as a cat, or even as a coyote or a fox. So um, even a lot of people use there's a Leggett's tool that's like a 4 foot stick with a C-shaped end of it
Yeah.
that you just hold him down to the ground with it, and then you can release the trap and let him go. And some of
Interesting.
those techniques are workable, usable.
Yeah. So I read that the badger has very loose skin.
Mhm.
So if you're trying to grab his skin, he has the ability, it's so loose he can actually turn around and bite. Is that been your experience? Well,
The
I know you haven't been bitten, but his the loose
the turning
skin.
around is yes.
Yeah.
Now there are places on him where his skin is far more loose. The center of their back, they have long guard hairs, and
Hmm.
you're probably really going to be in danger if you try to grab that.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
the legs and belly are quite short-haired, and there's probably not enough hair to get a hold of. But uh, again, I would certainly at least have big, heavy welder's gloves if I was going to mess with that. But I don't even recommend doing it that way. Period.
Right.
A good catch-all catch pole or some version of that makes it much safer and much simpler. And there's no reason to be in the industry if you're not prepared to deal with
Yeah.
that a little bit.
Do
Yeah.
you want to make sure that one of the arms is through the loop of the catch pole, or does that just overkill that cat getting the neck is enough?
Ideally, if you can get one arm and the neck in there, then you
Yeah.
know that you're not constricting on the trachea and all
Yeah.
that.
Okay. All right.
Uh, but it's difficult because of their structure. So
Yeah.
I end
Yeah.
up usually getting it behind the ears and tight enough. And it's a quick deal.
Yeah.
Once I pulled it tight, I push the pole hard down so his nose is pushed in the dirt.
Yeah.
Then I get the trap off and then I'm away. And if you practice that, think it through, it can be just a matter of seconds. It's a
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
quick deal.
Yeah.
I've never had one pursue me.
Right.
Sometimes they stand on that hole and guard their ground after I let them go. And it's okay, well, you can stay there if you want to.
Sure. Yeah.
Whatever you want to do now is up to
Yeah.
you. I'm done,
Yeah. He probably doesn't want it. Yeah, because being chased, he probably don't. He doesn't want to be chased.
He's not going to
So
chase you back to the truck in my experience,
yeah.
although never say never,
Never.
but
Yeah. Animals make liars of all of us.
that's
So
right. That's right.
yeah. If I'm not. So as you said, be careful of grabbing an animal. It's just not. I'm with him when I was in business. I didn't have badgers in my area, and I there were a lot of animals I didn't grab. So, but there are some individuals who are a little bit more courageous or foolish. I'll let you decide what you think those are. I just don't recommend
I'm,
it.
I'm with you 100%. A good catch pole, a
Good
release
catch,
stick.
Paul. Yeah,
There are a
good.
variety of even a lasso. If you could pull him at change length
Yeah,
with a
yeah,
regular lasso that you can shake loose once you get the trap on. Anything but grabbing him is my recommendation.
yeah.
So,
Do
but
you do you think there's any? You were talking about the mating season, and do you think there's would be any value in someone creating a lure of, let's say, a female urine, badger urine, in when she's in heat? You think
I,
that would be because
I,
there are no badger lures, right? I mean, you got all these coyote lures, right? But I don't know of anyone who's like marketed. Not that it would ever be that targeted specific, but I mean something marketed where it says, they really like this. And it would seem to me that a female urine of a badger in heat would probably
it would
be worth a
absolutely
shot
be, it would absolutely be wonderful, but it would only be wonderful
for a
in
few,
August.
right, for a few,
In
right,
that
for a
short
period of time.
parameter of time. But it would be very good. And I would, if anybody comes up with that, please give me a call. I'll be the first customer.
What
But
about the soil? What about the soil with badger odor in it? We do that with woodchucks, for example, and
yeah,
uh, where you catch one badger, you just simply scrape up the soil underneath where the cage was and put it in a baggie and not in the food freezer. You should have a separate freezer for your trapping supplies, folks. Just throwing it out there, right? Don't put it in your kitchen freezer
there is.
because it is contaminated. You don't know what's in there, right? You could have listeria and all other things. Poo and urine are bad. Don't be making sure you're careful with this stuff. But that I found that to be incredibly effective for attracting woodchucks. I'm just wondering if that would help with badgers.
It would under special circumstances and under most circumstances. And uh, along those lines, if I catch a badger, I always remake at that location
Okay.
because of the badger odors that are there.
Yeah.
Um, but when it's not during the breeding season, they tend to be allopatric. They don't
Yeah.
particularly care where the hell the other badgers are, unless they're competing. And so it would not have the kind of effectiveness that a coyote territoriality gland lure would have most of
Okay.
the time.
Yeah.
A badger probably would be interested if he's got a defined territory and you put that gland from a foreigner in there, it would probably work. It's such a limited market that I can't imagine anybody would, as far as I know, none of the lure makers that I know have even
Yeah.
bothered.
They
The
would.
other thing about it is, and this is the sad truth about writing a book about trapping badgers, I probably could have written in one paragraph, and that is go set 30 coyote traps.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Catch that accidental badger, right? But
That's
it's
really, and it's
yeah.
the truth. It is the
Yeah.
truth because they're interested in odd odors.
Yeah.
My best attraction has to do with something very loud and raucous, and I like skunk.
Hmm.
Uh, I mentioned in the book that there are two or three companies that have skunk-based lures that are very loud. I even do one where I collect my essence usually, and what I don't sell, I put into Vaseline, warmed Vaseline, and that makes a wonderful attraction. I don't know that badgers are, how do I put this, intellectually capable of many of the things that we see canines and felines do,
Yeah.
but they know that bad stink is interesting.
Yeah.
And well, that big bad stink will typically attract them even when they're not hungry. So,
Yeah.
uh, um, that's kind of where I'm at with that. But again, if you're after a specific coyote and you've got a problem coyote and you really want to get him, the best way it's the best way to catch a badger. But I would immediately remake him the next day. You may have that coyote because
Yeah.
if he's in a territory, that anomaly is going to be very attractive to him. So
Well, I could certainly see how it wouldn't, badger lure would be probably not profitable for bait makers to make. I get that. But for the wildlife control operator, if he did catch one, would it behoove him to try to extract the urine? Or
uh,
if there's feces still in the colon to use that, or do you think that's kind of a fool's game at that point? It's just
Uh,
not worth the effort.
yes, and yes, and yes.
Yes, and yes, and yes. Okay.
I have done all of those things on
Okay.
various occasions, but in my own attempts to produce something that I thought was going to be badger specific, first of all, it won't be.
Right,
It'll
right.
still be attractive to pets and cats and dogs. And secondly, they're not unusually difficult to attract to a specific odor. And I don't care if it's fox or skunk or most any mammal will get
Yeah.
their attraction. So the need is minimal there.
Minimal.
The
Yeah.
hard part is to get it where he'll smell it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and with other badger, other than that 2 or 3 weeks of the mating season, I don't think they much care where their other badgers are.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. Mm,
so it doesn't have the kind of attraction that it would for typical canid or feline attraction. And I suppose that and the fact that they go to everything, you probably I think a little bacon grease would probably work if you follow me. And I
just
don't
as
think
well as
there's a
anything else. Yeah.
if it has some edible components in it, they're going to probably go check it out. So
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, fascinating. Is there anything, hold your book up again for the audience. And so we want to make sure. So badger trapping by Dave Hastings, and it's available from sterlingfur.com. Sterling like sterling silver, right?
correct.
Sterling Fur, FUR.com, and you can purchase his book there. It costs $12 plus shipping and handling. So if you're interested in badger trapping, like I said, there's very few books. It's a thin market out there, but there's so you got to take advantage of the experience because it can help you avoid at least some mistakes that are going to cost you. So, and for the price, you're going to save yourself. You're going to save more in avoiding mistakes than the cost of the book and shipping. So make sure you get a copy. And then there's some tidbits on life in there that are going to be probably useful for you as well, if nothing else, if not for badger trapping, for life that you should probably consider as you're doing your work. Anything that we haven't mentioned about badger control and badger work that you want to emphasize or clarify with the audience here, as some of them may ever encounter a badger work in our audience.
I guess if I'm trying to empathize with someone that may or may not ever have had experience dealing with badgers,
Yeah.
uh, client communication is critical.
Mm,
They need to understand the serendipity of this. They need to understand that under most circumstances, when a badger comes into a particular area, digs up a hole, digs up a gopher, a ground squirrel, or whatever, he's basically done and he's nomadic. And so he's going to be on his way. And it can be very difficult to convince a client that you know what you're doing when you have a trap in place for 5 days and nothing's been caught and they're
right.
going,
Yes.
so what are you charging me then for your daily
It's
drive-bys? So
yeah.
they need to understand the challenges of that and the what I would call badger specific behaviors like that make them a damage control problem. Uh, on the other hand, if you have a badger and you think he's still there, he could be remarkably easy to catch. And
Yeah.
boy, you
Yeah.
can look like the hero of the world. It is wonderful to solve people's problems.
Sure.
It's one
Sure.
of the
Absolutely.
real blessings of doing damage control is that people don't normally call you just because they're curious. They need you to fix this.
Mm,
And when you fix it, it is a very good thing for them and you both, especially if you can do so in a way that lets them know that you don't particularly like to kill things. You're here to solve problems
right. Right.
and make everybody get a better deal out of it. But
Yeah, I would agree. In Montana, what I tell people when they have badge, because up here we have ground squirrel, like the Richardson ground squirrel, Colombian ground squirrel, and their numbers can be quite high and really encourage a lot of badger activity as they're hunting these animals. Pocket gophers as well.
mhm.
And I just tell people they won't even care. The farmers won't even care about the damage the ground squirrels. They're like, you know, and they'll just say, I just got to get rid of that badger. Because some of them break axles and from some of their equipment in it and things like that, and that can be quite expensive to be sure. But I tell them, look, if you I just say control the food source. No food, no badger. So the badger will just simply move on. I don't think I win a lot of friends doing that, but given the challenges of trapping badgers, it's probably the wisest course of action for most of them,
It,
anyways.
it probably is. If you do commit to the work, be prepared to excavate or unexcavate the dirt.
That's right.
Badgers will, it's almost like even in an alfalfa field where a farmer's driving over it every day, if he just sees that hole, he said, "Oh my gosh, it's a grave size hole." And
Yeah,
the pile of dirt's 3 feet high in several directions. And
yeah, yeah.
so you need to be prepared. And typically, most ag people have a sense of rural nature and know that, okay, it's dirty now, but the alfalfa will come back and it'll be all right tomorrow. But if that's somebody's glowing front yard, it's going to be a little
That's
problem.
going to be a little tough. Yeah, without a doubt.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Dave, so much for talking about your book. And your book is, just a reminder, hold it up again for our audience here, Badger Trapping. It was published in 2024. Dave Hastings, and you can purchase your copy at sterlingfur.com. That's sterlingfur.com, sterling like sterling silver, sterlingfur.com. And like I said, there's so few books on badger trapping. Pick up a copy of him. He was the former editor of Fur Taker magazine, and so he knows how to write, which is always a blessing. And he's got some interesting information in there for things that we haven't even talked about today. So I don't want to give you every piece of information there. So there's more, but for $12 plus shipping and handling, it's going to save you a lot of it's going to save you from expensive mistakes that are certainly going to you'll be like, oh, I wish I'd have paid the $12 plus shipping and handling. So sterlingfur.com. Dave Hastings, thank you so much, Dave, for being with us and sharing your experiences and expertise with our audience. So you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. I'm Stephen Vantassel. I'm the host, and if you're wondering what is this all about, well, we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest control. So if that's of interest to you, you've come to the right place. So we get a little geeky, as you probably heard here. We'd love to have you subscribe to the channel. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, perhaps you even want to be on the show, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. And yes, even if you have criticisms, you can send those along as well. So I would love to hear from you. Do subscribe if you can. And again, this is Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.